weeks, just 14 days. That's all it would have taken, Donald Trump claimed, for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. But, according to him, the United States acted first, and with full force. In June, 3 critical Iranian nuclear sites were struck, a move Trump described as decisive, but one that sent shockwaves across the globe. The immediate question for diplomats, analysts, and citizens alike was terrifying. Was this a justified preemptive strike meant to prevent catastrophe, or a reckless gamble that could ignite wider conflict in the Middle East and beyond? The global response was swift and intense. China, careful and calculating in its foreign policy, condemned Washington outright. Fu Song, China's top security diplomat, called the U.S. the instigator of the Iranian nuclear crisis, accusing it of blatant force that undermined ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Beijing's warning was clear. Unilateral aggression, even under the banner of national security, could destabilize the fragile world order. Meanwhile, Europe, led by Britain and France, insisted that Iran's failure to address legitimate concerns about its nuclear program justified renewed sanctions. France warned that the International Atomic Energy Agency could no longer guarantee the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear work, and estimated that Tehran's stockpile was sufficient for at least 10 nuclear devices. Suddenly, the world felt as if it were teetering on a knife's edge. To fully understand the June strikes, one must look back at the history that set the stage. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been a source of tension for decades. Tehran has insisted its program was for peaceful energy and medical purposes, but Western observers and U.S. intelligence repeatedly expressed concern over secretive sites and enrichment activity capable of producing weapons-grade material. Multiple administrations pursued diplomacy, sanctions, and covert measures, culminating in the 2015 nuclear deal hailed as historic. Yet, when Donald Trump became president, he adopted a new strategy: abandon the deal, impose aggressive sanctions, and act militarily if necessary. By 2026, tensions had reached a boiling point. Trump publicly warned that Iran was on the verge of crossing a red line, claiming that without action, it would have a nuclear weapon within weeks. Critics questioned this timeline, noting intelligence assessments did not fully support it. Yet, the claim set the stage for a dramatic escalation. The U.S. strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites did not only target facilities, they sent a message. In Tehran, Iranian officials condemned the attacks as unprovoked aggression, vowing to defend their sovereignty. Nationalist sentiment surged, uniting factions that had long been divided. Across Europe, diplomats tried to balance criticism of unilateral military action with the need to maintain international order. China's response framed the U.S. as a destabilizing force, warning that aggressive action during negotiations could destroy any prospect for lasting peace. The stakes were enormous. The crisis was not only about Iran's nuclear program, it was about global diplomacy, power, and regional stability. The U.S. risked overstepping, potentially destabilizing the Middle East, while China and Europe sought to influence outcomes without escalating conflict. Behind the headlines, ordinary citizens were gripped with fear. Families in Tehran, London, and Washington watched anxiously, knowing that military action could have direct and indirect consequences for civilians. Analysts warned that the nuclear sites were near civilian areas, and even precise strikes carried significant risk. Every decision was intertwined with human impact, economic stability, and regional consequences. Within Washington, the atmosphere was equally tense. Advisors debated the validity of Trump's claims, weighing intelligence reports against political considerations. Some urged restraint, warning of the dangers of a wider Middle Eastern conflict. Others argued that decisive action was necessary to prevent an existential threat and demonstrate U.S. resolve. Trump, known for his unorthodox approach, framed the strikes as preventive and essential, emphasizing that the United States would not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons capable of threatening global security. Critics, however, warned that political motivations might have influenced decisions with life or death consequences. The geopolitical fallout was immediate. China's condemnation highlighted tensions between superpowers, while Europe tried to maintain sanctions without provoking escalation. Iran began preparing for contingencies, balancing military, diplomatic, and strategic options. The region became a tinderbox where one misstep could trigger a wider conflict. The crisis also underscored the fragility of global nuclear order. Historical events like the Cuban Missile Crisis or North Korea's nuclear tests demonstrate how miscalculations can escalate quickly. The June strikes and renewed sanctions added a new chapter to the story of nuclear brinkmanship. Markets fluctuated, alliances were tested, and ordinary citizens felt the anxiety of living under the shadow of potential nuclear confrontation. Analysts pointed out that targeting nuclear facilities embedded in civilian infrastructure risked destabilization, retaliation, and proliferation. Every statement by world leaders, every media report, every tactical decision could ripple across continents, creating an interconnected web of risk. By mid-2026, the situation had reached a tense equilibrium. Iran remained defiant, strengthening its military and preparing contingencies. China warned repeatedly against unilateral force, emphasizing the importance of diplomacy. Europe maintained sanctions to constrain Tehran while avoiding escalation. Trump maintained that U.S. actions were justified, framing them as necessary to prevent an imminent nuclear threat. The world was caught between fear, calculation, and the ever-present threat of miscalculation. This was not merely a military crisis, it was a crisis of perception, diplomacy, and strategy. Could diplomacy survive amid unilateral military action and public claims of imminent threats? Would sanctions succeed without provoking dangerous retaliation? Or had the world entered a phase where even minor errors could trigger catastrophe? The answer remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the decisions made in June 2026, actions, words, and strategies, would reverberate for years. The human, political, and economic stakes were immense. Families, citizens, and governments around the world faced uncertainty, while markets, energy supply, and trade routes were increasingly vulnerable. Leaders had to consider both the immediate tactical impact and the long-term strategic consequences of every move. Even a small misstep could escalate into a confrontation with global ramifications. History reminds us that miscalculations in nuclear confrontations can be catastrophic. The world remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tense standoffs with North Korea, and other moments when brinkmanship brought nations to the edge. The June strikes and sanctions on Iran marked a new chapter in this history, reminding the world of the dangerous balance between power, diplomacy, and survival. Yet amidst the uncertainty, the narrative was clear. The world was watching, waiting, and bracing for what might come next. Donald Trump positioned himself as a decisive leader, willing to act unilaterally to confront threats. Critics warned that such unilateralism risked undermining global trust, destabilizing the region, and creating consequences beyond control. Europe, China, and Iran were now actors in a tense game of strategy, perception, and deterrence. The Middle East, already volatile, became a chessboard where every decision carried risk for the world. Ultimately, the June strikes were not only a test of Iran's nuclear ambitions, they were a test of global diplomacy, international norms, and the limits of unilateral power. The stakes were higher than at any point in decades, and the world had to navigate a complex and dangerous landscape. Each leader, each decision, and each reaction could determine whether the crisis escalated or found a path towards stability. The human cost remained undeniable. Families across the Middle East, Europe, and the United States experienced fear and uncertainty. Markets and global economies fluctuated. Analysts calculated every possible scenario, from localized retaliation to regional war. Leaders knew that a single misstep could cascade into catastrophe. By the end of 2026, the world found itself in a tense standoff. Iran remained defiant. China maintained a vocal stance against unilateral aggression. Europe balanced sanctions with careful diplomacy. And the United States, under Trump, insisted on its right to act preemptively to protect national and global security. The question persisted. Would diplomacy prevail? Would sanctions succeed in constraining Tehran? Or had a new era of global nuclear tension begun? One fact was undeniable. The stakes had never been higher, and the story was far from over. The world was watching, waiting, and every action, word, and strategy could change the course of history. Donald Trump, Iran, Europe, and China were all players in a high-stakes drama where the consequences extended far beyond immediate borders. Every decision mattered, every misstep could be catastrophic, and the shadow of nuclear risk loomed large over the world. The future remained uncertain, the risks unprecedented, and the consequences potentially global. As the world watched, one thing was clear. The story of Trump, Iran, and the nuclear showdown was far from over, and a single moment could redefine history, diplomacy, and the balance of power in ways no one could fully predict.